February 13th, 1945. 9:51 p.m. The air raid sirens over Dresden had been silent for 2 hours. In the cellars and bomb shelters beneath the Baroque city, refugees and residents began emerging into the cold winter night, believing the danger had passed. Oberfeldwebel Hans Voigt, a Wehrmacht supply officer stationed at the garrison, stood in the Altmarkt square smoking a cigarette, watching the sky. The first raid had been unsettling but not catastrophic. A few fires burned in the distance, their orange glow reflecting off the low clouds. Dresden, the Florence of the Elbe, had survived relatively intact while other German cities had been reduced to rubble. Many believed the city's cultural significance would spare it from the worst of Allied bombing. Voigt knew better. He had seen the reports from Hamburg, from Cologne, from Berlin. When the British came, they came in waves. The first raid was never the last. At 10:14 p.m, the sirens began again. This time there was no orderly return to shelters. People ran. Voigt dropped his cigarette and sprinted toward the garrison command post, but he never made it inside. At 10:22 p.m, the sky turned red. Not the normal red of fire or sunset, but an unnatural pulsing crimson that seemed to emanate from the clouds themselves. Then came the sound, a low drumming that built to a roar as 529 Lancaster bombers of the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command approached from the west. What happened over the next 14 hours would create a firestorm so intense that it generated its own weather system, produced winds exceeding 150 miles per hour, and raised temperatures hot enough to melt glass and stone. The attack on Dresden would become the most controversial bombing raid of World War II, a subject of debate that continues 80 years later. But for the German troops and civilians who lived through that night, there was no debate. Only terror beyond anything they had imagined possible. To understand what happened at Dresden, we must first understand the weapon that the Royal Air Force had spent years perfecting. The firestorm was not an accident. It was the intended result of a carefully developed tactical doctrine called area bombing, designed by Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command. Harris, known as Bomber Harris to his crews and Butcher Harris to his critics, had witnessed the German bombing of British cities during the Blitz. He had walked through the ruins of Coventry, seen the devastation of London, and counted the civilian dead. His response was to create a bombing strategy that would make German cities uninhabitable. The technique was scientific in its precision. First-wave bombers would drop a mixture of high-explosive bombs and incendiaries. The high explosives would blow off roofs, shatter windows, and rupture water mains, creating ideal conditions for fire. The incendiaries would ignite thousands of small fires throughout the target area. If done correctly, these small fires would merge into larger conflagrations that would consume entire city blocks. Under perfect conditions, the fires would coalesce into a single, massive blaze that would create its own atmospheric phenomenon, a firestorm. The firestorm effect had been discovered accidentally during the bombing of Hamburg in July 1943, during Operation Gomorrah. The conditions that night had been perfect. Low humidity, wooden buildings packed closely together, and an overwhelming concentration of incendiary bombs. The result had exceeded anything the RAF planners had anticipated. The fires merged into a single inferno that created a thermal column rising miles into the atmosphere. Air rushed in from all sides to feed the flames, generating hurricane-force winds that sucked everything toward the fire centre. Temperatures in the fire zone exceeded 400 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to spontaneously ignite any combustible material. People caught in the open were lifted off their feet by the winds and thrown into the flames. Those who sheltered in basements suffocated as the fire consumed all available oxygen, or were roasted alive as the shelters became ovens. The Hamburg firestorm killed an estimated 37,000 people in a single night. It was the proof of concept for what area bombing could achieve. Over the next 18 months, Bomber Command refined the technique, studying meteorological conditions, building densities, and bomb mixture ratios. By February 1945, they had perfected the science of urban destruction. Dresden was selected as a target for multiple reasons, none of them purely military. The city was a major rail junction through which German troops and supplies moved from west to east, as the Wehrmacht tried to stem the Soviet advance. It contained numerous factories producing optical equipment, poison gas, and aircraft components. But most significantly, Dresden was packed with refugees fleeing the Red Army's advance through Silesia. Population estimates range from the pre-war 630,000 to over 1 million with the refugee influx. The city was a target-rich environment. The decision to bomb Dresden came from the highest levels. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin had requested that the Western Allies conduct bombing raids to prevent German troop movements to the Eastern Front. Churchill, eager to demonstrate British military contribution to the Soviet war effort, directed the air staff to prepare operations. Dresden, largely untouched by previous raids, was fourth on the target list after Berlin, Leipzig, and Chemnitz. Weather conditions would determine which city burned. On February 13th, the weather over Dresden was forecast to be clear. The first wave, consisting of 244 Lancaster bombers, took off from bases across England beginning at 5:30 p.m. Each Lancaster carried a precisely calculated bomb load. The Pathfinder aircraft carried green target indicators, pyrotechnic markers that would burn brightly enough to guide following waves. The marker aircraft carried a mixture of 4,000-pound high-capacity bombs, called blockbusters, and clusters of 4-pound magnesium incendiary bombs. The main bomber stream carried even more incendiaries, each aircraft loaded with approximately 100 individual firebombs. Flight Lieutenant James Campbell, piloting a Lancaster from 50 Squadron, had participated in 31 previous raids over Germany. He later recalled the briefing for Dresden. The intelligence officer told us it was a virgin target, practically undamaged, old city, lots of wooden buildings packed with refugees. The implication was clear. This was going to be a big one. We were told to expect minimal flak and no night fighters. The Germans had moved most of their air defences to protect oil facilities and other strategic targets. Dresden was nearly defenceless. The first wave reached Dresden at 10:13 p.m. Master Bomber Wing Commander Maurice Smith, flying a Mosquito Pathfinder aircraft, orbited above the city at 8,000 feet, directing the attack by radio. The aiming point was the Osterkirch Sports Stadium near the Old City Centre. At 10:14 p.m. the first target indicators fell, brilliant green stars that ignited 3,000 feet above the city, descending slowly on parachutes, bathing the Baroque architecture in an eerie emerald light. Voigt, still running through the Altmarkt, watched the green lights blossom overhead. He had seen target markers before, knew what they meant. He dove into the nearest cellar entrance as the first bombs fell. The initial loads were blockbusters, 4,000-pound thin-cased bombs that created enormous blast pressure. They didn't penetrate deep into the ground. They didn't need to. Their purpose was to create chaos, to strip away the protection that buildings provided, to expose the combustible material inside. The blockbusters fell across the Altstadt, the old city, with devastating precision. Each explosion lifted entire roofs off buildings, sending tiles and timbers hundreds of feet into the air. Windows shattered for blocks around each impact. The blast waves propagated through streets and alleys, turning the medieval city into a maze of debris and exposed interiors. Then came the incendiaries. Each Lancaster released its load in a single pass, and 1,500 4-pound thermite bombs tumbling through the sky. They fell like metal rain, clattering onto roofs, bouncing into attics, rolling into cellars. The magnesium thermite mixture ignited on impact, burning at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt through metal roof sheeting and ignite the wooden beams beneath. Within minutes, thousands of fires were burning across the Altstadt. Margrethe Freyer, a young woman who had taken shelter in a cellar on Marienstrasse, later described the first moments after the incendiaries hit. We heard them clattering on the roof like hail, metallic thuds and bangs. Then we smelled smoke. The cellar warden went up to investigate and came back, his face white. "The entire block is on fire," he said. "We have to. Evacuate." We went up to the street. I couldn't believe what I saw. Every building was burning. The sky was orange and red, and the heat was like standing too close to an oven. The first wave dropped 1,800 tons of bombs in 24 minutes. By 10:38 p.m., when the last Lancaster turned for home, central Dresden was a sea of flames. But this was only the beginning. The RAF's plan called for a second wave to arrive 3 hours after the first. This timing was deliberate. 3 hours gave rescue workers time to emerge from shelters, fire brigades time to begin fighting the blazes, and refugees time to flee burning buildings and gather in parks and open spaces. Then the second wave would catch them all in the open. At 1:22 a.m. on February 14th, 5:29 more Lancasters approached Dresden. Flight Sergeant Peter Russell, rear gunner on a 463 Squadron Lancaster, saw the city from 50 miles away. The glow on the horizon was visible from extraordinary distance. As we got closer, I could see it wasn't just fires. The entire city was glowing like a bed of coals. The smoke column rose to our altitude, 20,000 feet, and kept climbing. I had never seen anything like it. The second wave found perfect conditions. The fires from the first raid had created a thermal marker visible for miles. The Pathfinders had little to do. They simply dropped their target indicators into the inferno, adding more fuel to an already massive conflagration. The bomb aimers on the following aircraft didn't need their H-2S ground scanning radar or their G-navigation equipment. They simply aimed for the light. This wave dropped 1,500 tons of bombs, concentrating on areas not yet burning and on the Neustadt district across the Elbe River. The effect was cumulative. Small fires merged into larger ones. Large fires merged into conflagrations. And then, at approximately 1:45 a.m., the conflagrations merged into a firestorm. Gefreiter Paul Schmidt, a Wehrmacht communications technician, was in a command bunker on the outskirts of Dresden when the firestorm developed. He had a direct view of the city centre. The fires had been large before, but contained. Individual buildings burning, blocks on fire, but separated by streets and open areas. Then, in the space of maybe 10 minutes, everything changed. The fires connected. It became one enormous blaze, and then the wind started. Schmidt described a phenomenon that meteorologists would later analyse in detail. The firestorm created a thermal column of superheated air rising rapidly to high altitude. Physics demanded that air flow in from surrounding areas to replace the rising column. This created wind, increasingly powerful wind that accelerated as it approached the fire centre. At the edges of the firestorm, the wind began at perhaps 20 miles per hour. By the time it reached the fire core, it was exceeding 100 miles per hour. Some estimates suggest winds reached 150 miles per hour or more. The wind didn't just feed the fire, it weaponized it. Burning debris was picked up and carried blocks away, starting new fires. People caught in the street were knocked down and dragged toward the flames. Those who tried to flee found themselves moving backwards, pulled inexorably toward the inferno. Hans Voigt had survived the first raid in a cellar near the Altmarkt. When the second wave struck, the building above his shelter took a direct hit from a blockbuster. The ceiling collapsed, killing half the people in the shelter instantly. Voigt and the survivors clawed their way out through the rubble. His account, recorded in a 1949 interview, captured the absolute horror of emerging into the firestorm. The heat hit me like a physical force. I couldn't breathe. The air itself was burning. The wind was so strong I had to hold onto the ruins to keep from being blown away. The noise was beyond description. The fire roared like 100 freight trains. The wind howled. Buildings collapsed with crashes that I could feel through the ground. I looked toward the Altstadt and saw what I thought was a solid wall of fire, but it was moving, pulsing like it was alive. I saw people running, their clothes on fire, their hair burning. They would take a few steps and collapse. I saw a woman with 2 children trying to reach the Elbe. The wind caught them and they were gone, just tumbled away into the flames. I saw a man standing in the middle of the street, not moving, just standing there as the fire approached. Then he burst into flames without the fire even touching him. Just spontaneous combustion from the radiant heat. The temperatures in the firestorm centre exceeded anything that could be measured by the instruments of the time. Post-war analysis of melted materials suggested temperatures between 4300 and 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to melt aluminum, hot enough to cause sand to vitrify into glass, hot enough to reduce human bodies to ash and fragments of bone. The cellars, which had saved people in previous raids, became death traps. As the fire consumed oxygen from the air, carbon monoxide accumulated in enclosed spaces. Most people who died in the cellars didn't burn. They suffocated, dying in their sleep as carbon monoxide poisoning shut down their central nervous systems. Others, in cellars directly beneath the most intense fires, were roasted alive as concrete and stone conducted heat downward. Gerhard Kuhnemund, a Hitler Youth member pressed into service as a messenger, was sent into the burning city to try to reach the central command post. He was 16 years old. His testimony, given to American interviewers in 1946, provided a ground-level view of the firestorm. I couldn't get within 2 blocks of the Altstadt. The heat was too intense. I saw the Frauenkirche, the Church of Our Lady, burning like a torch. The dome was glowing red. I watched it collapse inward, centuries of history gone in seconds. The streets were rivers of fire, melted asphalt flowing downhill, carrying burning debris. I had to turn back. I tried to reach the Grossergarten, the park. I thought people would be sheltering there. When I got close enough to see, the park was full of bodies. Hundreds, maybe thousands. They had fled there thinking they would be safe in the open, but the firestorm generated so much radiant heat that they died where they stood. Many were still sitting or lying in family groups. They looked like they were sleeping, but their skin was black and their clothes had burned away. At 1:54 a.m, the last aircraft of the second wave released its bombs and turned for England. Behind them, Dresden was dying. But the ordeal was not over. At 12:12 p.m. on February 14th, in full daylight, 311 American B-17 flying fortresses of the 8th Air Force arrived over Dresden. They had been briefed to bomb the marshalling yards, the rail junctions that were the strategic justification for the raid. What they found was a city obscured by a smoke column rising to 15,000 feet. Lieutenant Robert Tays, bombardier on a B-17 of the 384th Bomb Group, later described the site. We could see the smoke from 50 miles out. As we approached, we could see the fires were still burning, 12 hours after the attack had begun. The city was covered in a pall of black and grey smoke. We couldn't see the ground clearly enough to bomb the rail yards with any precision. The lead bombardier decided to bomb on radar returns through the smoke. We dropped our loads and got out. Looking back, I saw our bombs adding to the destruction. I felt sick. This wasn't war. This was slaughter. The American raid dropped 771 tons of bombs, a mixture of high explosives and incendiaries. Their stated target was the rail infrastructure, but with visibility obscured by smoke, many bombs fell on residential areas or into the still-burning city centre, adding fuel to fires that were already beyond control. The American crews faced more danger than the British night raiders had. German fighter units, alerted by the previous night's attack, scrambled to intercept. The Americans encountered fierce resistance from Messerschmitt Bf-109Ns and Focke-Wulf 190s, losing 6 B-17s to fighters and flak. Several German pilots who participated in the defence were horrified by what they saw below. Lieutenant Wilhelm Jonnen, flying a Bf-109 with Jagdgeschwader 301, recorded his impressions. We climbed through the smoke to attack the American bombers. When I looked down during a break in the clouds, I could see the city was gone, just gone. Entire districts reduced to burned-out shells. The streets were visible as white lines through the ash and rubble. I realised I was looking at a dead city. We shot down 2 bombers, but it felt pointless. What was there left to defend? On the ground, the firestorm had largely burned itself out by late morning, not because it had been extinguished, but because it had consumed everything combustible in its path. The destruction was total across a roughly 6 square mile area, not damaged, not severely hit, obliterated. Gefreiter Heinz Bergmann, arriving with a Wehrmacht pioneer unit to assist with rescue efforts, found a landscape that defied comprehension. The Altstadt didn't exist anymore. Buildings that had stood for 800 years were reduced to rubble and ash. The streets were lined with corpses, most of them unrecognisable as human beings. Many had been reduced to ash and bone fragments. Where the fire had been hottest, there was nothing left but shadow marks on stone where people had stood. The Frauenkirche, the Church of Our Lady, had been Dresden's signature landmark. Its stone dome, completed in 1743, had dominated the skyline for 2 centuries. When Bergmann reached the square where it had stood, he found only the hollow shell of the outer walls and mountains of rubble. The dome had collapsed during the firestorm, its sandstone blocks fragmenting from thermal stress. The Zwinger Palace, Dresden's Baroque masterpiece, was a burned-out shell. The Semper Opera House, where Wagner had premiered his works, was gutted. The Japanese Palace, the Albertinum, the Catholic Court Church, all reduced to ruins. But the cultural losses, devastating as they were, paled against the human cost. The exact death toll from the Dresden raids remains controversial to this day. Nazi propaganda immediately claimed 200,000 dead, a figure designed to emphasise Allied barbarity. Post-war East German authorities, seeking to portray Western allies as war criminals, inflated numbers even higher, sometimes claiming 500,000 victims. Modern historical research, including a thorough 2010 commission of historians, established a death toll between 22,700 and 25,000. This number, while far lower than propaganda claims, still represents one of the highest single-event death tolls of the war in Europe. The majority died from suffocation, carbon monoxide poisoning, and burns. The dead posed an immediate crisis. With infrastructure destroyed, water mains ruptured, and thousands of decomposing bodies in the ruins, there was immediate risk of epidemic disease. The solution was medieval in its brutality. Oberst Eberhard Matthes, the military commander of Dresden, ordered the mass cremation of bodies in the Altmarkt Square. Beginning on February 23rd, Wehrmacht pioneers constructed enormous pyres, stacking corpses in alternating layers with wood and coal. The pyres were lit and burned continuously for weeks. Otto Griebel, a Dresden artist who survived the raid, witnessed the cremations. They built the pyres 6 feet high and maybe 40 feet long. They would lay railroad ties, then bodies, then more ties, then more bodies, maybe 500 per pyre. Then they would soak it with oil and light it. The smell was beyond description. It permeated the entire city. You could taste it in your food, smell it in your clothes. It became part of you. The psychological impact on German troops in Dresden was profound. Many of these were not combat veterans but support personnel, clerks, supply officers, communications, technicians who had never experienced the reality of modern industrial warfare. What they witnessed in Dresden shattered their perception of what war could be. Oberleutnant Werner Moltzer, a logistics officer with the L7th Army Corps headquarters, wrote in his diary, captured after the war, "I had thought I understood war. I'd seen bombed cities before, damaged buildings, casualties, destruction. Dresden showed me I understood nothing. This was not war. This was the end of civilization, the deliberate annihilation of a city and its people using scientific methods. I walked through streets where every building for blocks had been reduced to rubble. I saw basements full of bodies, families who had died together, huddled in corners. I saw a tramcar full of charred corpses still sitting in their seats. I saw a bomb shelter where 300 people had suffocated, their bodies showing no external injuries but their faces frozen in expressions of terror. What kind of war is this? What kind of men could plan this, execute this, and call it military necessity? I am ashamed to be part of humanity that can do such things." The raid's impact extended beyond physical and psychological damage. It represented a demonstration of Allied air power that shattered any remaining German illusions about defending their cities. If Dresden, far from the main bombing routes and considered relatively safe, could be destroyed so thoroughly in a single night, no German city was safe. Goebbels' propaganda machine tried to spin Dresden as a war crime that would stiffen German resistance. Radio broadcasts and newsreels showed the ruins, interviewed survivors, and claimed that the Allies were targeting civilians in terror attacks. But among German military personnel, the reaction was more complex. Some felt rage and wanted revenge. Others felt despair, recognizing that a nation capable of destroying Dresden so casually possessed resources beyond Germany's ability to counter. The Western Allies' official position was that Dresden was a legitimate military target due to its role as a transportation hub and industrial centre. This was technically true. The rail yards were major junctions, and the city did contain war-related factories. But the targeting of the Altstadt, the old city centre, with its concentration of wooden buildings and civilian population, made clear that the primary goal was not destroying rail capacity, but implementing area bombing doctrine against a soft target. Churchill himself seemed to recognise that Dresden represented a step too far. On March 28th, 1945, he sent a memo to the air staff questioning the area bombing policy. It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing of German cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. The destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. The memo was quickly withdrawn after Harris and others protested, but it revealed discomfort at the highest levels about what had been done. The controversy over Dresden would persist for decades. In East Germany, the communist regime used Dresden as anti-Western propaganda, painting the raid as a deliberate massacre of civilians. In the West, the raid became a focal point for debates about strategic bombing ethics. Some historians argued it was militarily justified and shortened the war. Others contended it was unnecessary at that late stage of the conflict and constituted a war crime. What's often lost in these debates is the perspective of the German troops who witnessed the aftermath. Their accounts, preserved in letters, diaries, and post-war interviews, consistently described Dresden not just as a tragedy but as revelation. They had believed, despite the evidence of Hamburg and other raids, that such destruction could not happen to them. Dresden proved otherwise. Lieutenant Klaus Fischer, a Wehrmacht infantry officer recovering from wounds in a Dresden hospital, survived the raid in a fortified basement. His account, recorded for American interrogators in 1945, captured the transformation of German military perception. Before Dresden, I believed we could still win. Not with victory perhaps, but negotiate an acceptable peace. We had new weapons coming, the jet fighters, the V-weapons. We had armies in the field. After Dresden, I knew we had lost. Not because of the military damage, though that was significant. Because of what the raid demonstrated. The Allies could destroy any German city at will. They had the aircraft, the bombs, the crews, the fuel. We had nothing to stop them. I watched Dresden burn and realized we were facing an enemy with infinite resources and the will to use them. Every city could become Dresden. There was no defense, no hope, only waiting for the end. The immediate military impact of the Dresden raid was substantial. Rail traffic through the city was disrupted for weeks. Refugees streaming west from the Soviet advance found themselves trapped or forced to detour. Wehrmacht units trying to move supplies eastward faced delays. But these tactical effects were secondary to the strategic message. Allied air power was absolute. The psychological effect extended beyond Dresden. News of the raid, despite censorship attempts, spread throughout Germany. Soldiers at the front heard about it through letters from home, through rumours, through the enemy propaganda leaflets that Allied aircraft dropped. The message was consistent. Nowhere is safe. Resistance is futile. Surrender or be destroyed. Obergefreiter Johann Schmidt, serving with an artillery unit on the Western Front, recorded in his diary after hearing about Dresden, "My family is in Hamburg, which was bombed 2 years ago. I have not heard from them in months. Now I hear Dresden is gone. How many more cities must burn before this ends? We are told to fight to the last, but for what? So more cities can be destroyed, so more women and children can burn. I will fight because I am ordered to, but I no longer know why." The firestorm phenomenon that consumed Dresden was studied extensively after the war. Meteorologists and weapons experts analysed the conditions that had created such a perfect storm of destruction. They identified several factors: low humidity, wooden construction, high-density building patterns, optimal bomb mixture, and perfect timing between raids. The studies led to improved understanding of urban fire dynamics, and eventually influenced both civilian fire prevention strategies and military targeting doctrine. In an ironic twist, the lessons learned from Dresden and other firestorm raids were applied by American planners in the Pacific Theatre. The incendiary raids on Japanese cities, particularly Tokyo on March 9th through 10th, 1945, used the Dresden formula with even more devastating results. The Tokyo raid killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, exceeding even the Hamburg death toll. For the German troops stationed in Dresden, the long-term psychological impact was severe. Many developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The sight of mass death, the smell of burning bodies, the sound of the firestorm's roar, these sensory memories haunted survivors for decades. Werner Moltzer, the logistics officer quoted earlier, never fully recovered. His post-war letters to his family, preserved in the Dresden city archives, revealed a man broken by what he had witnessed. "I dream of the burning city every night. I hear the screams. I smell the smoke. I see the faces of the dead. People tell me to forget, to move on, that it was war and these things happen. But I cannot forget. I will never forget." What we witnessed in Dresden was the future of warfare. Not soldiers fighting soldiers, but nations destroying nations, civilians burning civilians. If this is the future, then humanity has no future. The physical reconstruction of Dresden took decades. The Frauenkirche remained a pile of rubble until German reunification, then was painstakingly rebuilt between 1994 and 2005 using original stones where possible. The new church stands as both a memorial and a symbol of reconciliation. Other buildings were rebuilt in simplified form or replaced with modern structures. The Altstadt today is a mixture of reconstruction, restoration, and new development, but the scars remain visible to those who know where to look. The debate over Dresden's military necessity has never been fully resolved. Some historians argue that disrupting rail traffic and destroying industrial capacity justified the raid, especially given the Soviet request for support. Others contend that by February 1945, with German defeat inevitable, the massive destruction of a cultural landmark and the high civilian death toll served no purpose beyond demonstrating Allied might. What cannot be debated is the raid's effectiveness as a weapon of terror. For German troops, throughout the Reich, Dresden became a symbol of Allied power and German vulnerability. It demonstrated that the British and Americans could, if they chose, reduce any German city to ashes. This knowledge affected morale, influenced surrender decisions, and contributed to the collapse of German resistance in the war's final months. The Dresden raid also complicated post-war relations. Soviet propaganda used Dresden to paint the Western Allies as barbarians, conveniently ignoring Soviet atrocities in occupied territories. The controversy over death tolls, inflated by both Nazi and later communist propaganda, made objective historical assessment difficult for decades. Not until the reunification of Germany and the opening of archives did historians reach consensus on casualty figures and military rationale. For many German veterans, speaking about Dresden remained difficult even decades later. Friedrich Reichert, a Wehrmacht signals corpsman who helped with rescue efforts, was interviewed in 1985 for a documentary about the bombing. He struggled to articulate his experience. How do you describe hell to someone who has never been there? The fires, the bodies, the smell, these are just words. They cannot convey what it was like to walk through a city of the dead, to see civilization reduced to ash and rubble in a single night. I am 76 years old now. I have lived a full life since the war. But a part of me died in Dresden in February 1945, the part that believed humanity was fundamentally good, that there were limits to what men would do to each other. Dresden taught me there are no limits. Given sufficient motivation and sufficient technology, we will destroy anything, anyone, without hesitation or remorse. The legacy of Dresden extends beyond World War II history. The raid has been referenced in debates over area bombing in Korea, carpet bombing in Vietnam, and precision strikes in Iraq and Afghanistan. It stands as the classic case study in the ethics of strategic bombing. When does a military target become a civilian massacre? How many civilian deaths are acceptable in pursuit of military objectives? These questions, raised acutely by Dresden, remain relevant in modern warfare. The technological evolution from Dresden to present day makes the ethical questions even more pressing. Where the RAF needed 800 bombers and 3,000 tons of bombs to destroy Dresden, a single modern weapon could achieve similar results. The democratization of destructive power makes the lessons of Dresden not historical curiosities but urgent contemporary issues. The German troops who experienced Dresden firsthand carried their trauma into post-war life. Many emigrated, unable to remain in Germany surrounded by reminders of what they had witnessed. Others threw themselves into reconstruction, seeking redemption through rebuilding. Some descended into alcoholism or depression, broken by memories they could not escape. A few became pacifists, devoting their lives to preventing future Dresdens. Hans Voigt, the supply officer who witnessed the firestorm's beginning, survived the war and became a civil engineer. He worked on Dresden's reconstruction for 30 years. In a 1975 interview, he reflected on his experience. I helped rebuild Dresden because I needed to believe that creation could triumph over destruction, that what man tears down, man can build again. But we cannot rebuild the 25,000 dead. We cannot restore the centuries of culture that burned in a single night. We can only remember and hope that remembrance will prevent repetition. But I fear it will not. The capacity for destruction grows faster than the capacity for wisdom. What happened to Dresden can now happen to any city, anywhere, in minutes instead of hours, and the next time there may be no survivors to rebuild, no one left to remember. The red sky over Dresden on the night of February 13, 1945, was visible for 50 miles. German troops across Saxony saw the glow and knew something unprecedented was occurring. By the time they learned what had happened, the news spread like the fire itself. carrying terror and despair throughout the Wehrmacht. The bombing of Dresden represented the culmination of strategic bombing doctrine. It showed what modern industrial warfare could achieve when resources, technology, and will combined without restraint. For the Allied air crews who executed the raids, it was a mission like any other, perhaps more intense than most. For the German troops who witnessed the results, it was the moment they understood the war was truly lost, not through military defeat, but through the revelation that their enemy possessed the power to erase German cities from existence. In the end, Dresden's significance lies not in the debate over its military justification or its ethical status as a potential war crime. It lies in what the raid demonstrated about the nature of total war in the industrial age. When nations commit fully to conflict, when the distinction between military and civilian targets erodes, when technology enables destruction on a scale previously unimaginable, the result is not war in any traditional sense. It is annihilation. The German troops, terrified by the red sky over Dresden, were witnessing the future of warfare, a future where cities burn in single nights, where thousands die in hours, where there is no defence and no escape. They had believed such things impossible. Dresden proved them wrong. The question that haunted German survivors, and that should haunt us still, is not whether such destruction was justified in that particular instance. It is whether humanity can survive in a world where such destruction is possible at all. The sky turned red over Dresden in February 1945. In the nuclear age that followed, we built weapons that could turn the sky red over the entire world. Dresden's lesson, purchased at the cost of 25,000 lives and a city's soul, is that the power to destroy exceeds our wisdom to refrain. Whether we learn that lessen or repeat Dresden's tragedy on a global scale remains the defining question of our age. The ruins of Dresden asked a question that echoes across the decades. What have we become, and what will we do with the power we possess? The German troops who stood in those ruins and asked that question received no answer. We have not found one yet. The immediate aftermath of Dresden revealed chaos on a scale that overwhelmed every system the Wehrmacht had for managing disaster. Oberst Eberhard Mattes, newly appointed city commandant, arrived at what remained of his headquarters building on the morning of February 15th to find his staff operating from vehicles parked in the street. The command post itself had burned, along with most of the communications equipment, personnel records, and emergency plans. Mattes, a career officer who had fought in France and Russia without flinching, stood in the Altmarkt and wept. His aide, Lieutenant Gottfried Bauer, later recorded the moment. The colonel was a hard man, not given to emotion. I had seen him maintain composure under artillery fire during Soviet assaults through the worst of the Eastern Front. But Dresden broke him. He looked at the ruins, at the smoke still rising 2 days after the raid, and tears ran down his face. "How do we come back from this?" he asked me. I had no answer. I don't think there was an answer. The first priority was water. The firestorm had consumed millions of gallons, and the ruptured water mains meant what little remained was draining uselessly into the ruins. Fire brigades from surrounding towns arrived to help, but there was nothing left to fight. The fires had burned themselves out through lack of fuel. Instead, the firefighters turned to the grim task of searching for survivors. Hauptmann Ludwig Erhard commanded a Wehrmacht pioneer company tasked with rescue operations in the Neustadt district. His unit spent 3 days pulling bodies from collapsed buildings. His official report, filed in late February and discovered in Soviet archives after the Cold War, provided a clinical description of hell. Day 1. Cleared 7 buildings, found 142 bodies, 3 survivors, most casualties from smoke inhalation, survivors in severe shock, unable to provide coherent information. Day 2. Cleared 12 buildings, found 217 bodies, no survivors, advanced decay due to heat, protective equipment inadequate, lost 4 men to building collapse. Day 3. Cleared 9 buildings, found 389 bodies, no survivors, many casualties reduced to skeletal remains, crew morale critical. Recommended rotation to preserve combat effectiveness. The terminology, combat effectiveness, applied to body recovery crews revealed how thoroughly the lines had blurred between military and civilian spheres. These were not soldiers fighting soldiers. They were men processing corpses on an industrial scale. The psychological toll was immediate and severe. Gefreiter Hans Richter, a 19-year-old, pioneer, kept a diary that was later given to American authorities. The entries from mid-February are almost unreadable, the handwriting deteriorating as the days progressed. February 15th. We are pulling out bodies. So many bodies. The sergeant says not to think of them as people, just as objects to be moved. But they were people. A woman still holding her baby. An old man with his dog. How do I not think of them as people? February 16th. The smell is in everything. My clothes, my hair, my skin. I taste it when I eat. The sergeant gave us schnapps to help. It doesn't help. Nothing helps. February 17th. Schmidt broke down today. Started screaming and couldn't stop. They took him away. I understand. I want to scream too. But if I start, I don't think I will stop. February 18th. We found a cellar today with maybe 200 people inside. They looked like they were sleeping, all huddled together. The sergeant said they suffocated, that it was peaceful. There was nothing peaceful about their faces. The refugee crisis that followed Dresden compounded the catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of people had been streaming westward through Dresden, fleeing the Soviet advance. With the city destroyed, these refugees had nowhere to go. The rail lines were cut. The roads were clogged with debris. Food and shelter were non-existent. Major Hans Schaefer, a supply officer with Army Group Center, was ordered to establish refugee processing stations around Dresden. His memoir, published in 1962, described an impossible task. I was given responsibility for perhaps 300,000 refugees with no supplies, no facilities, and no transportation. People were dying by the hundreds daily from exposure, disease, and starvation. We had no medical supplies. We had no food beyond what we could requisition from already starving local populations. I watched children die because we had nothing to give them. Mothers begging for food for their babies. Old people lying down in the snow and simply giving up. And always, the survivors from Dresden itself, wandering in shock, many still searching for family members who were certainly dead. The Wehrmacht's response revealed an organization nearing collapse. Units were stripped of men to provide labor for refugee management. Supply chains already stretched beyond breaking were expected to support hundreds of thousands of additional mouths. Medical personnel were overwhelmed treating injuries, disease, and mental breakdowns. Oberarzt Heinrich Müller, a Wehrmacht surgeon, operated a field hospital on Dresden's outskirts. His letters to his wife, preserved in family archives, revealed the medical crisis. We are performing amputations without anesthesia. We have no morphine, no sulfur drugs, no bandages except what we tear from our own clothes. I operated for 16 hours straight yesterday. 4 patients died on the table, not from their wounds but from shock and malnutrition. They had nothing left to give. Today a woman brought me her daughter, maybe 7 years, old, burned over 60% of her body. I told the mother I could do nothing. The child would die whether I intervened or not. The mother screamed at me, called me a murderer, said I had abandoned them. She was right. I have abandoned them. We have all abandoned them. There is nothing left to give. The disease that followed was inevitable. With thousands of decomposing bodies, no clean water, and masses of refugees living in unsanitary conditions, Dresden became an epidemiological nightmare. Typhus appeared first, spreading through refugee camps with terrifying speed. Dysentery followed, then typhoid. The Wehrmacht's medical infrastructure, already inadequate, proved utterly incapable of managing the crisis. General Oberst Karl Hilpert, commanding the remnants of Army Group Vistula, received a situation report from Dresden on February 28th that quantified the catastrophe. Civilian casualties from bombing, 22,000 to 25,000 confirmed dead. Estimated refugee deaths from exposure and disease since raid, 8,000 to 12,000. Military casualties, 847 killed in raid, 2,200 casualties from subsequent disease and accidents. Infrastructure status, 90% of city centre destroyed, rail capacity reduced 40%, communication sporadic, water system inoperable, power system partially functional. Military effectiveness, garrison units at 30% strength, supply operations severely degraded, hospital capacity overwhelmed, morale critical. Assessment, Dresden no longer militarily significant. Recommend evacuation of all non-essential personnel and designation as open city. The recommendation to declare Dresden an open city, abandoning it without resistance to approaching Soviet forces, revealed how completely the bombing had achieved its strategic objective. Dresden as a military asset had ceased to exist, but declaring it an open city would have required Hitler's approval, and Hitler was not accepting reality. Instead, the Wehrmacht was ordered to continue operations as if Dresden remained functional. Oberst Gustav Wilke, operations officer for the Dresden garrison, received orders on March 3rd to prepare defensive positions around the city. His response, sent up the chain of command and preserved in military archives, was scathing. "With what forces shall we defend? The garrison is at 30% strength. The men who remain are exhausted from rescue operations and demoralized by what they have witnessed. We have no ammunition reserves, no fuel stocks, no food beyond 3 days' supply. The positions you order us to prepare cannot be constructed because we have no labor, no materials, and no equipment. More fundamentally, what are we defending? The city is dead. There is nothing here worth a soldier's life. If we are to fight a defensive battle, let it be somewhere that still exists." The response from higher headquarters was predictable. Execute orders as given, defeatism will not be tolerated. Wilkie executed the orders, his men dug foxholes in the frozen ground, emplaced machine guns covering rubble-strewn approaches, and prepared to defend ruins that no one actually wanted. The absurdity was not lost on the soldiers. Unteroffizier Werner Scholz, an infantry squad leader, wrote in a letter to his brother that was intercepted by military censors, "We are ordered to defend Dresden to the last man. But Dresden is already dead. We sit in frozen trenches surrounded by corpses, protecting nothing from no one. The war is lost. Everyone knows it except the madmen in Berlin. If the Russians come, I will not die for this. I will surrender. Better a living prisoner than a dead hero of a country that no longer exists." The letter resulted in Scholz's arrest for defeatism. He was court-martialed, sentenced to death, and executed by firing squad on March 8, 1945. His crime was not insubordination or cowardice, but speaking truth that could not be officially acknowledged. The Wehrmacht was defending a corpse and sending men to die for rubble. The Soviet advance reached Dresden on May 7, 1945, the day before Germany's unconditional surrender. The German defenders, what few remained, offered scattered resistance before melting away. The Soviets occupied a city that barely existed. Their own accounts expressed shock at the destruction. Marshal Ivan Konev, commanding the First Ukrainian Front, toured Dresden, and later wrote in his memoirs that he initially believed the damage was the result of ground combat. When informed it had been accomplished by air attack in a single night, he reportedly said, "If we had such bombers, Berlin would have fallen in 1941. The Soviet occupation brought new horrors to Dresden's survivors. Rape, looting, and summary executions became commonplace. The German troops who had witnessed the firestorm and remained to face the Soviets found themselves victims of an enemy with no mercy for those who had invaded their homeland. But by this point, many welcomed even brutal occupation as preferable to the limbo of the preceding months. At least with the Soviets came an end to uncertainty. Obergefreiter Paul Schneider, captured by Soviet forces on May 8th, spent 5 years in a labor camp in Siberia. Upon his return to Germany in 1950, he was interviewed by West German authorities. His perspective on Dresden had evolved through years of reflection. "In the camp, I had time to think about what happened. I hated the British for years after Dresden. I considered the bombing a war crime, murder of innocents, terrorism designed to break our will. But in the camp, I met Russian prisoners, men who had survived the siege of Leningrad, the destruction of their cities, the death of their families at German hands. They told me about the Einsatzgruppen, about the mass murders in the East, about deliberate starvation of millions. They asked me where my moral outrage had been when German forces were destroying Soviet cities. I had no answer. I still believe Dresden was wrong, but I no longer believe we were innocent victims. We sowed the wind and reaped the whirlwind. The British gave us back what we gave to others. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it comprehensible. We started the machinery of total war. We cannot complain when that machinery crushes us." This perspective, that Dresden represented not unprovoked terror but retaliation in kind, became more common among German veterans as the full scale of Nazi atrocities became known. The moral clarity that many felt immediately after the bombing eroded as the death camps were liberated and the extent of German war crimes was revealed. Dresden's suffering, real as it was, existed within a context of suffering that Germany had inflicted across Europe. The reconstruction of Dresden became a Cold War symbol. East Germany, under Soviet control, rebuilt parts of the city but left the Frauenkirche in ruins as a memorial to Allied terror bombing. The message was clear: this is what the capitalist West does to workers' cities. West German observers noted the selective preservation of ruins for propaganda purposes, while other devastated areas were quietly cleared and rebuilt. The psychological impact on German veterans who had experienced Dresden persisted for decades. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not yet widely diagnosed or understood, affected thousands. The symptoms were consistent: nightmares, hypervigilance, survivor's guilt, depression, anxiety. Many veterans self-medicated with alcohol. Suicide rates among Dresden survivors were significantly elevated compared to veterans who had not experienced the bombing. Dr. Friedrich Panse, a German psychiatrist who studied war trauma in the 1950s, interviewed dozens of Dresden survivors. His clinical notes, preserved in medical archives, documented consistent patterns. The patients describe intrusive memories, primarily visual and olfactory. The sight of burning buildings triggers immediate anxiety responses. The smell of smoke, even from a cigarette or fireplace, can induce panic attacks. Many report feeling guilty for surviving when others died. This guilt is exacerbated by the knowledge that their survival was largely random, that there was no skill or virtue that saved them, merely chance. The lack of meaning in the selection of victims troubles them deeply. Several patients report feeling that they died in Dresden and that their current existence is somehow unreal or temporary. They speak of waiting for the real end, as if Dresden was merely postponed rather than survived. Treatment is difficult. Traditional talk therapy provides little relief. The memories are too powerful, too sensory. One patient said, "You cannot talk away the smell of burning flesh. It is always there, waiting." The long-term health consequences extended beyond mental health. Respiratory problems from smoke inhalation affected survivors decades later. Cardiovascular disease rates were elevated, possibly due to prolonged stress. Cancer rates among those exposed to the firestorm's toxic smoke showed measurable increases in later life studies. The children who survived Dresden, even those too young to remember it consciously, showed developmental impacts that researchers would identify years later. Hauptmann Gerhard Klein, who had commanded a Wehrmacht signals unit in Dresden, emigrated to Australia in 1952. His daughter later wrote about her father's experience. He never spoke about Dresden directly, but it was always there, the elephant in every room. He would not allow candles in the house, he could not watch fireworks. Thunderstorms sent him into the basement trembling. As a child, I found this behaviour odd but not alarming. As an adult, I understand that my father never left Dresden. His body came to Australia, but his mind remained in that burning city. He died in 1979, and his last words were in German, something about smoke and fire. Even at the end, 34 years later, Dresden was claiming him. The cultural impact of Dresden on German military identity was profound. For centuries, German military culture had emphasized discipline, tactical brilliance, and battlefield prowess. Dresden demonstrated that none of these qualities mattered against industrial-scale strategic bombing. The Wehrmacht's proud martial tradition could not defend against 800 bombers dropping incendiaries. This realization that traditional military virtue was obsolete undermined the foundation of German military self-conception. General Major Otto Lasch, who commanded the defense of Königsberg and later wrote extensively about German military failures, identified Dresden as a symbolic turning point. Dresden proved that Clausewitz was obsolete. He wrote of war as an extension of politics, of battle as a clash of wills, of victory through superior strategy and morale. But what strategy defends against firestorm? What morale survives the incineration of cities? The British did not defeat our armies at Dresden. They erased the battlefield entirely. This was not war as we understood it, but something new, industrialized annihilation that rendered traditional military concepts meaningless. The impact on post-war German military doctrine was significant. The Bundeswehr, established in the 1950s, emphasized civil defense and dispersed operations. The memory of Dresden and other bombing raids influenced everything from military base design to communications redundancy. Never again would German forces concentrate in cities that could become firestorm targets. The international impact of Dresden on strategic bombing doctrine was equally significant. The controversy over the raid contributed to post-war restrictions on area bombing. The Geneva Conventions were revised to provide greater protection to civilian populations. The principle of proportionality, that military advantage must outweigh civilian harm, became central to targeting decisions. But the fundamental capability demonstrated at Dresden, the ability to destroy cities through air, power alone, remained. The nuclear weapons that followed made the firestorm method obsolete not because it was abandoned, but because it was superseded by even more efficient destruction. Where Dresden required 800 bombers and 3,000 tons of bombs, a single nuclear weapon could achieve greater destruction. The progression from Dresden to Hiroshima was measured in months, not years. The German troops who survived Dresden and witnessed this progression understood that they had seen the future of warfare. The firestorm was not an aberration but a preview. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Schulze, who had coordinated rescue operations in Dresden and later worked for NATO during the Cold War, gave a lecture in 1978 that was transcribed and archived. He spoke about the evolution of strategic bombing. Dresden was horrific, but it was conventional. It could be survived, as I survived. Buildings offered some protection. Cellars saved many lives. The firestorm was massive but localized. 10 miles from the city centre, people slept through the raid. Nuclear weapons eliminate all distinctions. There is no shelter, no safe distance, no survival through luck or pluck. Dresden killed 25,000 in a night with 3,000 tons of bombs. Hiroshima killed 80,000 instantly with one bomb weighing 4 tons. The mathematical progression is terrifying. We've created weapons that make Dresden quaint, that transform the firestorm from ultimate horror to minor inconvenience. When I lecture on Dresden, young officers ask what lessons we should learn. I tell them the lesson is simple. War between industrial powers in the nuclear age means mutual annihilation. There are no winners, no survivors, no recovery. Dresden was terrible. Nuclear war is extinction. If we forget that, if we imagine that strategic bombing can be controlled or limited, we doom ourselves to discover that Dresden was merely the opening act. The comparison between Dresden and nuclear warfare became central to Cold War civil defense planning. German authorities, both East and West, used Dresden as a case study for what would happen in a nuclear exchange. The firestorm effects, the mass casualties, the infrastructure destruction, all became baseline assumptions for nuclear war scenarios. Civil defense planners studied Dresden's casualty patterns to project nuclear war deaths. Medical authorities analyzed Dresden's public health crisis to prepare for post-nuclear disease control. Emergency management studied Dresden's rescue operations to understand what would not work after nuclear attack. The conclusion was unanimous. Modern warfare had transcended human capacity to manage its consequences. The cultural memory of Dresden in Germany evolved over decades. Immediately after the war, it was remembered primarily as Allied terror bombing, a narrative that fit both Nazi propaganda and East German communist messaging. In West Germany, as the full extent of Holocaust atrocities became known, the narrative shifted toward Dresden as tragic but comprehensible retaliation. By the 1980s, with German reunification approaching, Dresden had become a symbol of war's futility rather than Allied criminality. The 40th anniversary commemoration in 1985 included both German and British veterans. The presence of RAF bomber crew members at the ceremony, laying wreaths alongside German survivors, symbolized reconciliation. But the event also sparked controversy. Neo-Nazi groups tried to use Dresden to relativize Holocaust crimes, arguing that Allied bombing was equivalent to German genocide. This equation was firmly rejected by mainstream German society and by most Dresden survivors themselves. Margot Hieler, who survived the Dresden firestorm as a child and later became an educator, spoke at the 1985 commemoration. Her words captured the evolved German understanding of Dresden's meaning. What happened here was terrible beyond words. I lost my mother, my grandmother, and 3 siblings in the firestorm. For years I hated the British for what they had done. But hatred is a heavy burden, and it obscures truth. The truth is that Dresden did not happen in isolation. It happened in the 6th year of a war Germany started. It happened after German bombers had destroyed Warsaw, Rotterdam, Coventry, and countless other cities. It happened while German forces were murdering millions in the east. The British who bombed Dresden were not evil men. They were men fighting a necessary war against an evil regime using the weapons their nation provided. They believed, perhaps correctly, that destroying German cities would shorten the war and save lives overall. Whether they were right or wrong is for historians to judge. What I know is this: Dresden is not a tale of German victimhood. It is a tale of what happens when nations embrace total war. We must remember Dresden, not to assign blame or claim victim status, but to remember where the path of violence leads. It leads to cities in flames and children burning. It leads to young men, British and German alike, traumatized by what they have witnessed and done. It leads nowhere worth going. If remembering Dresden prevents future Dresdens, then perhaps my mother and siblings did not die for nothing. This perspective, viewing Dresden as tragedy rather than crime, as consequence rather than cause, represented mature historical understanding. But it remained controversial. Russian and Polish observers noted that German focus on Dresden seemed disproportionate, given the vastly greater destruction Germany had inflicted on Eastern European cities. The debate over historical memory and appropriate commemoration continued. The military archives contain thousands of documents related to Dresden, reports from commanders, diary entries from soldiers, medical records, casualty lists, damage assessments. Collectively, they paint a picture of an event that overwhelmed every system designed to cope with disaster. The Wehrmacht, for all its organizational efficiency, simply could not process destruction on Dresden's scale. The breakdown in military discipline following Dresden was notable. Desertion rates increased significantly across units that had personnel from Dresden or had participated in rescue operations. Courts-martial for defeatism spiked. Orders were increasingly ignored or half-heartedly executed. The psychological impact on military cohesion was measurable and severe. General Major Helmuth Reimann, appointed to command the defence of Berlin in March 1945, recognised that units containing Dresden survivors were unreliable for sustained defensive operations. His personnel assessments, captured by Soviet forces and later released, identified exposure to strategic bombing as a key predictor of unit degradation. Units with high percentages of personnel from Hamburg, Dresden or other heavily bombed cities showed significantly reduced combat effectiveness. These troops had seen that no defence was possible against strategic bombing. They understood that fighting only prolonged the destruction. Their resistance in Berlin was correspondingly less fanatical than troops from less affected areas. The lesson: strategic bombing's greatest military effect may not be direct damage to war industry, but degradation of military morale and cohesion. The final German military assessment of Dresden was written in May 1945 by Oberst Werner von Freytag-Loringhoven, operations officer at OKW, as part of a larger study on why Germany lost the war. The section on strategic bombing used Dresden as the primary case study. Dresden demonstrated the obsolescence of continental power in the face of sea and air power. Britain could launch 800 bombers from invulnerable island bases. Germany could not retaliate in kind. The strategic imbalance was absolute and insurmountable. No amount of tactical brilliance at the front could compensate for our inability to defend the homeland from air attack. The Luftwaffe, for all its early war success, proved incapable of strategic defence. Night fighters accounted for only a tiny percentage of attacking bombers. Flak was marginally more effective but still inadequate. The British losses at Dresden were negligible compared to the damage inflicted. This asymmetry of casualties, where we lost a city and they lost a handful of aircraft, encapsulates why we lost the war. We could not impose unacceptable costs on enemies who could strike our homeland with impunity. The psychological effect was perhaps more significant than material damage. Every major city in Germany lived in terror of becoming the next Dresden. This fear undermined war production, disrupted transportation, eroded morale, and made rational planning impossible. How do you run an economy when any factory can be incinerated overnight? How do you maintain military discipline when soldiers know their families are defenceless? Dresden broke something essential in the German war effort: the belief that effort and sacrifice could still yield victory. After Dresden, even the most fanatical understood that we were defenceless against enemies who commanded the skies. The document concluded with a stark assessment. Future German military strategy must accept that wars between industrial powers will be decided by whoever can most efficiently destroy the enemy's cities and industrial base. Traditional military virtues, tactical skill, operational brilliance, strategic acumen become irrelevant when the homeland burns. Germany's geographic position, surrounded by potential enemies and lacking the strategic depth of continental powers like Russia, or the oceanic protection of Britain, makes us perpetually vulnerable to the Dresden scenario. This is a military problem without a military solution. This conclusion, that geography and industrial capacity mattered more than traditional military prowess, was revolutionary for German military thought. It represented a complete break from the Clausewitzian and Moltke traditions that had dominated German military education. Dresden had forced a fundamental reconceptualization of what military power meant. The human cost of that reconceptualization was 25,000 dead in Dresden, tens of thousands more who died in the following weeks from disease and exposure, and hundreds of thousands of survivors who carried physical and psychological scars for life. The German troops who witnessed Dresden understood that they had seen not just a city die, but an entire conception of warfare rendered obsolete. The red sky over Dresden was the funeral pyre of 19th century military thought. What rose from those ashes was the modern understanding that war between industrial powers means the destruction of the homeland, that there is no rear area, no safe distance, no protection for those who cannot strike back. This knowledge, purchased at terrible cost in Dresden and 100 other destroyed cities, remains the foundation of modern deterrence theory. We maintain peace through the mutual understanding that war means mutual annihilation. The German troops terrified by Dresden's red sky learned that lesson first. The rest of the world learned it at Hiroshima. Whether we remember it well enough to avoid repeating it remains the great question of our age. Dresden stands as both warning and memorial, a city that died so that we might understand what we are capable of doing to each other. The soldiers who stood in those ruins and asked how humanity could do such things still wait for our answer.